Good morning, everyone. Nice to see everyone. I think most of you know me. I'm Jed Larson. I give occasional talks here, give classes, meditation instruction, and also work in the office. You may notice I recognize my name from that, and that's where I am now. So this is the office. This is where it all happens if you're ever curious what it looks like. But yeah, just happy to be here with you today. Speak a little bit about a Buddhist term that I was thinking about recently that I thought might be interesting to talk about a little bit, and that is signlessness. You may have come across this term here and there reading about Buddhism. I thought it would be interesting to kind of look into it a little bit. Before I do, I thought we could just acclimate ourselves a little bit with the term sign itself. When I was thinking about signlessness, part of me was kind of wondering what exactly do I think a sign is, just to begin with. Of course, you can think of a lot of different examples that come up in life. If you're on a road trip somewhere and you see a road sign, if you're heading towards Yellowstone or something like that, you see a sign for Old Faithful, that road sign, I think, in thinking about the term sign, is representing something else, maybe a way to get there, and indication that Old Faithful is nearby. Or even if we are right there at those benches that surround I think, almost the whole geyser. And I remember going there, just kind of a interesting thing. I sat down and there's names carved in the wooden bench that's in circle. It's like a lot of benches, basically. I looked down and the name Jed was right there. I was like, it's a pretty uncommon name. So I was like, oh, this is some sort of serendipitous moment or something. But we see Old Faithful right there in front of us. And I think we can think of that just in pondering what the term sign means, that when we look at something that we think is a particular thing right there in front of us, that very quickly a sign, or we recognize it, we're kind of interpreting it from our history of understanding how geysers work and things like that. So there's these labels that come up very quickly for us. I thought I'd bring up a short story, just a quick story here about a camping trip that I was on. Might help illustrate the point a little bit about signs. We were canoeing up in northern Minnesota, and at night we heard this sound coming from the lake. It's probably one of the loudest sounds I've heard out in nature. If you can imagine somebody playing intermittent, very loud notes on a French horn, just coming across the lake and reverberating off the far shore. And of course, there's a trumpeter swans. And on top of that, there was loons. I don't know if there was kind of a chain reaction. We heard loons, and then we heard owls, two owls talking back and forth. So it was, and then also rolling thunder in the distant background. So it was this exquisite concert of sound out in nature. And the next day we were paddling around, we saw the trumpeter swans again. And it's kind of a story about sound in a way. Back in the woods, which maybe is not too common in the middle of the day, we heard this constant kind of machine-like sound of the mosquitoes. Maybe if you've been camping at night, you recognize this kind of wall of sound. Normally it happens at night, but this is during the day. There's a massive number of mosquitoes back in the woods, buzzing with this kind of very weighty sound, louder than you would think if you've never heard it before. And the trumpeter swans were nearby too. And I just happened to notice, maybe by luck, that this noise that the mosquitoes were making, this very constant pitch, when the trumpeter swans would honk, that mosquito sound would rise in pitch just very briefly right during those honks. So it'd be right when the trumpeter swans honked. And the reason, it was just kind of astonishing. I don't know why they were reacting, why the mosquitoes were reacting to the swans sound like that. But I thought it was an interesting illustration of a natural scene where we think about maybe signs, we think about one mosquito, what is the sound of that? The sound that you're hearing? Is it one mosquito or is it the group of mosquitoes? Which, by the way, I was wondering what a group of mosquitoes is, kind of like a pride of lions. I looked it up and it's a scourge of mosquitoes, which seems very appropriate somehow. But, what is that sound? Is it the scourge of mosquitoes? That wavering of sound? Is that the mosquitoes or is that the trumpeter swans? And just in an experience like that, I think we can see that our notion of signs tends to break down, or just in light of that experience that's happening, we can see that there is a very limited nature to our signs and our labels. Because these signs, are essentially just ways of describing an infinite number of ways of describing how reality shows up. And they're literally endless. We can pick out anything, that one mosquito or the whole group or whatever it might mean, or whatever it is that we're kind of focused on. But really, does anything make sense, in a setting like that there's things in complete isolation? So it's kind of a vivid example of that, in that signs do presume this isolation, this fragmentation. And just to realize that, to begin to realize that, and then the term signlessness is pointing to a different type of understanding that is beyond this isolated way of interpreting what we think reality is. So everything is happening in concert. I think of maybe a yield sign or something like that, maybe being a little more conducive. It's not really representing anything in particular, but it's maybe something there that we can recognize as useful, or kind of way of showing us how to navigate the world in some ways, and that we can actually see these seeming objects that come up in our life in the same way that when we describe them, it's just simply a way to help navigate and communicate with other people. But really, at the base of it, these signs and labels are limited in their nature. They don't actually represent what we think they do. We think a label can be applied to something out there. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this teaching of signlessness. He uses an illustration of, say, taking some water from the ocean, and if we can put it in a square container or a round container. It could be any type of shape, and essentially the squareness is the sign, or the roundness is the sign. There's no true underlying quality. There's limits to examples too. You could sort of solidify your idea of water here, but I think the illustration makes kind of a nice point that when we think about signs or labels, we're just thinking about kind of just general characteristics or squareness or roundness. And so when we experience is just exhibiting itself in terms of shape, color, form, really what's presenting itself is it just looks like, this seeming reality. It just looks like what we associate with a particular sign or description. I think about I went to the MIA, it was a little while ago, but just thinking about a painting, if you think particularly of a big painting, and I think art is helpful in a lot of ways of really loosening our ideas of what we think the world is. And when you think about looking at a painting, it's just much less of a tendency to really attribute, though in some ways you don't at all, you don't attribute solidity to, whatever form and color that is being experienced there. I think that's a really fabulous quality of art, that it kind of innately doesn't have this substance that we immediately attribute. I think there's kind of a tendency just to see the whole painting more than individual pieces there. So it's just, I'm not saying that, it's nothing more than just a little example of how seeing a painting has maybe just a little bit of a looser view. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at a little bit here. There was a painting by John Singer Sargent that I'm thinking about in particular. And all it is it was just a image of the front of it. Looked like a kind of Middle Eastern or Greek ancient temple, like with pillars, essentially kind of a European ancient temple. And the light on the pillars was just incredible. I was saying to myself, how is it, just looks so real, the depth that I was looking at there. And I think in some sense, while we recognize that signs are limited, experiencing art or something like that, it is real, because all that is ever experienced is reality. We just tend to define things in certain ways. We solidify onto what we think is a true object. So that question, is it real? Maybe there's a deeper understanding that we do know direct experience is real. That no matter what it is, a painting, or we're out in nature and hearing sounds, what is experienced is, not that a particular person is experiencing, but reality is showing up in a true and direct way, always. And I say that in conjunction with a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh here. So he asks, where should we look to find the world of no signs? And he says, right here in the world of signs. So this is not about escaping anything or trying to reinterpret something. It's just simply about coming back to the immediacy of the moment. If that's just taking a breath. And I noticed the other day, cicadas were going off in the neighborhood. It was just nonstop sound. And I just noticed all of a sudden the cicadas, they weren't really there before. I was probably just thinking about this or that. I'm not sure what I was thinking about, but just coming back to this immediacy and not needing to add any type of label at all, I think is what the teachings are trying to point us towards. To see this complete picture that is already completely vital and fully alive. I think the teaching of signlessness has a lot in common, or it's essentially the same teaching as emptiness. Another translation of signlessness that I found was no externals. So you think about no inside, no outside, no in between. Emptiness is a teaching that is pointing at, pointing that reality is free of substance. It's free of fragmentation. And I think maybe we hear about emptiness and it may sound a little jarring. I think that's only because so often we'll hear something and then we kind of interpret it in terms of kind of a philosophy, or maybe try to come up with, what does it mean then? I mean, are things kind of vacuous then, or, we'll try somehow to come up with, even if it's not just like a very blatant thinking process, our mind will just kind of be in this questioning mode somehow. And I say that, at least for me, that sometimes it's helpful just to hear a teaching like that, hear the teaching of non-substantiality, and to hear it kind of just as a meditation. Because I think really the only way to truly understand that is to experience reality directly in its empty nature, emptiness itself, basically. And I think we can talk about emptiness as freedom, really. Freedom from substance, fragmentation. Because really we do, if we're honest with ourselves, we do package things up. It's kind of what we're used to doing. Emptiness, I think, also speaks to freedom from suffering, too, and to keep that in mind. In the Dhammapada, we're kind of right in the middle of the Dhammapada, there's this extremely, in my opinion, profound teaching. That's the teaching of the three Dharma seals. I think there are other Dharma, or marks of existence or something like that, but they're right there in the Dhammapada. And one of them is that conditioned things are dukkha, are suffering. So I think what that's telling us is that when we see something that we think is a thing, this entity on its own, separated out, that itself actually is suffering. You think about fear, anxiety, greed, all of those things rise out of a sense of self and other. That person has something that I want, that thing, so I'm going to take it from them. So what the Dhammapada is saying here is, if we invest ourselves fully in this object of thingness, it's not even a cause and effect thing. Right there is going to be dissatisfaction. Or maybe you could just use a little less of a charged phrase and just say that there will be this out of kilter nature to experience in thinking of the world as this and that, me against other people, the things that are dreaded, or the things that we really want. But then to see emptiness also as freedom, this free and total expression of reality. That's the only way that reality could show up, is completely free of any type of bounds or, solidifying signs or labels or anything. So where should we look for this world of freedom? Right here in the world of form and color and sound, and to be here and take care of our experience moment by moment. Think of the turmoil that happens in the world too. And Thich Nhat Hanh, in the book, I refer to a few things. It's The Heart of Buddhist Teaching. He says, peace begins with me, which I think is a very quite helpful teaching as well, that we recognize that seeing turmoil come up, and there's many things that we need to deal with in the world, that we recognize that our own understanding is very important, that we really focus on our own activity. Again, he says, peace begins with me. There's a short little section here I thought that aligned a little bit with some of the things that are going on. Again, this is from Thich Nhat Hanh. He's talking about signlessness. He says, politicians, economists, and educators need to practice signlessness. So Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about how just navigating our relative world, if we can understand what's really going on here, that plays a role in how we are operating in the relative world. He says that politicians, economists, and educators need to practice signlessness, or we just need to do this. We put many young people in jail, but if we meditate on signlessness, we will discover where violence comes from. What is our society like? How are our families organized? What is taught in our schools? Why should we lay all the blame at the feet of young people? Why can't we acknowledge our own co-responsibility? Signlessness is not just an idea. When we look deeply into our children, we see that all the elements that have produced them, they are the way they are because of our culture, economy, society, and we ourselves are the way we are. And that's why we are the way we are. We can't simply blame our children when things go wrong. Many causes and conditions have contributed. When we know how to transform ourselves and our society, our children will transform also. I was going to mention something here. Kind of forgot, but I think in understanding what signs are, what signlessness is, there's this opportunity to feel and navigate the world with a different type of sensitivity, something maybe that we didn't really know before. Of course, I think we can find that we all make the quick judgments, which are always based on limited ideas, and getting a better sense of true insubstantiality is a way that we can potentially move around in the world in a way that's less harmful. To let our open-mindedness become open-heartedness. And again, this is not a philosophy, but meeting our life with immediacy. And we ourselves need to recognize ignorance itself. It's not something we can point out to other people. It's not something we can fix in other people. And I think it is just innately the path of humility to recognize that and try to cultivate that. I know with in kind of learning about racial equity, uh, I think one of my first impulses was just kind of pretty simplistic in that, okay, I need to help minorities somehow, which was kind of revealing for me to think that my default was that I kind of had the answers and I was going to essentially, you know, improve other people or something. I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking there. It was just you know, it was, my intentions were to be helpful, but I think it did point to a tendency where we try, you know, our inclination is to look out into the world, to try to fix other things rather than, you know, in that case, maybe study how I may be contributing to different problems that may be arising. So it's an understanding again that, uh, you know, the teaching of Buddha is not some lofty thing where we just are trying to create our own bubble of peace and happiness. It really has to do uh, with, I think, ultimately um, understanding universal peace, actually, um, beyond actually any idea of separation at all. And that the teachings of Buddhism are something that can permeate our entire life. Not that we would want to try to use Buddhist teachings to, you know, as a tool to try to improve ourselves. Again, this is just kind of latching on to new ideas and signs and labels and techniques. But to let this quietude of practice, again, just permeate our action itself, not worry about any particular outcome. The teaching of signlessness comes from a something called the Three Doors of Liberation. It's not too common of a teaching. And before talking about the title of that, the Three Doors of Liberation, I'll just list them. Actually, two I've talked about already: signlessness and emptiness. And then the third one is apranahita, which is non-pursuit. So you have these three teachings. I found there's not much more than a list of them in a lot of places. Prajnaparamita and Pali Canon. That's in Thich Nhat Hanh's book here too. I thought I'd talk about the title just very briefly, Three Doors of Liberation. And it's also called the Three Concentrations. But I would just say that it's maybe, you know, I was just trying to think of what was the title that I would kind of use there, because I think to think of this as a door to liberation can be problematic in a way. If we think of, you know, something that we're going somewhere else, or we need to go through something to get something else, you know, is maybe it's not pointing us right to what these three very core teachings are. The title Three Concentrations, I think, maybe captures an element in terms of concentration that this is something that needs to be practiced. This is not about philosophy, but again, I don't think maybe it's the best to think about concentration coming in different versions, or that there's three of them. I don't know, maybe it just makes things a little too complicated in some sense. So I don't know if I quite like that title either. There's also things like the Four Mindfulnesses that you might come across too. And I think, at least for me, you know, to give the impression that there's different types of mindfulnesses is perhaps not so useful. I'm not objecting at all to the underlying teaching. I think it's interpreted, say, for the 4 mindfulnesses, as these are the 4 different types of things you can do during meditation or something like that. But actually what it's talking about is whatever is arising, if it's our posture, I think body is one of them and mind is another. So whatever happens, whatever is coming up, mindfulness practice, mindfulness meditation we can meet the world exactly how it is, whether it's we come up with any number of different ways of different things happening in our world. So it's not about 3 concentrations, I would say, but the term concentration here is pointing to the teaching that we shouldn't be approaching this as understanding a philosophy. It really should be about understanding that we need to practice, or what's being suggested here is that we practice signlessness itself. We practice the understanding of what emptiness is truly pointing to practice non-pursuit, non-gaining, which is that third. So maybe I would borrow from Dogen a little bit here. He has the term practice realization. And I would say that these are the 3 teachings of practice liberation, where there's not nearly a sense of some sort of outside goal, but to understand that practice and liberation are this exact moment to bring full attention to experience that itself is the truth of reality immediately. There's no door to go through at all. We're all always completely bathed in truth, so to speak, although there's some problems with saying it like that too, but this reality is already and always complete. That last one, non-pursuit, there's a couple other definitions. Thich Nhat Hanh says, no program, no agenda, which I thought those were pretty nice. For the apranahita, that third of the 3 teachings of practice liberation. He says, a couple other ones, Chinese terms, wu yuan, non-wishing, or wu xiao, non-arising. Thich Nhat Hanh says, the purpose of a rose is just to be a rose. You are out in a garden and you actually stop to smell the rose, which is always a good thing to do. And just that smell, a rose is just a rose. It's not trying to impress you with its smell or anything like that. Or even if you kind of reach up to your library bookshelf and you pull out a book and it kind of falls open on its own and there's a rose petal in there, and you just instantly remember a day from 20 years ago where you're on a picnic or something like that. And this practice is not about scolding ourselves for thinking about the past or anything like that, but the world of signlessness shows up right here in the world of signs. So a memory comes up. There's nothing wrong with that at all. What the practice is just simply not to be fooled by signs, so we can enjoy that memory. Or maybe you're with somebody that's no longer here, where you gathered that rose petal up, and understand the depth of what life is, it's not what we think it is. It could never be how we define it, but it is truly only possible as just reality as it is. There's no other way for this kind of stupendous experience of memory to come up, but it only has its true depth because it actually is beyond any type of characterization. And it is most definitely not a particular thing. Whatever comes up is truly free of substance. Even thoughts and emotions, to think of them as not free is really to, it doesn't even make sense to try to think of what that would be in some sense. It is completely vivid, no matter what we think of it. So the term rest and awareness, I think, is a nice way to maybe think about how our practice can unfold when we think about, how exactly do you do not doing or not gaining, or this non-program or non-agenda? How do I do that? Obviously, we're just tacking on another agenda. But to rest in awareness is something that, yes, our life is just full of different things where we kind of do this and that, just like we always have. So there's an element of effort, just a reasonable effort, an honest and steadfast effort to come back to what this is. I think part of that is realizing that if, we think this is kind of just not do anything, what we'll actually be doing is imparting an idea of laziness and self-satisfaction just by, I don't need to do anything. So just to keep that in mind, that non-agenda and non-program is not about going back into our own little bubble and just being kind of doing whatever we want and not being serious about life, because I think we all do understand that this life is, there's what could be more, I don't know if serious is the right word, but the import that we feel deeply about life, our life and other people's lives, and I think even more deeply beyond the idea of self and other, that clarifying this matter is definitely worthy of making that simple and straightforward effort, just resting in awareness. I think one clue I've had is to, just to recognize impatience. When we think about understanding non-pursuit, non-agenda, non-program, no program, no non-gain, impatience is a bit of a clue, I think, that we are usually operating with the motivation of getting and trying to transform, change other people, and so forth. I think sitting in meditation, there can be a sense that it's just not enough, or there's something else that I could be doing. And I don't think it's helpful to necessarily, not necessarily, it's not helpful to label that as impatience during meditation. But I think these different things can be teachers. This kind of scenario of impatience can be a teacher, in that we see right there in that moment, we are practicing by thinking about something else that we want to do. We're living a life of something elseness, essentially. That's what our life is in that moment. And again, not to come down hard on ourselves for that, because I think impatience can really be a great teacher. It's something to work with in this moment. If we were just totally comfortable and everything was set up for us, we would really have nothing to work with. So these so-called, whatever we think about as non-desirable things or confusion or whatever, it actually is the weeds, or it's the material that becomes the fertilizer in some ways. I mean, it's just definitely to get beyond the idea that these things are good or bad or whatever else, because there's just an infinite way of trying to make a judgment about what's happening in our life, and just to drop those different agendas. And I should say too that in talking about this teaching of, what was which like non-pursuit or non-agenda, might presume that we would just not do anything about the different things that come up in life. But I think clearly Thich Nhat Hanh, in talking about understanding signlessness and looking at maybe mass incarceration or different issues that we have dialogues about, that we can't just drop those. So it's not about, I think if we do that, basically we're just choosing what we don't want to do and getting rid of it because we think it's too hard or whatever it might be. We're not actually practicing non-agenda. To treat life as a meditation is to truly be here for whatever is happening. And of course, we are navigating the relative world in all kinds of different ways. And we need to take care of those the best that we can. So this non-doing is not about shirking responsibilities that might be important to consider, potential responsibilities. Thich Nhat Hanh also says that worrying does not accomplish anything. Also, anxiety can actually make things worse. So again, this is, I think it's, in a sense, in talking about the peace begins with us. And we really can't be a refuge for others if we're constantly thinking about the outside world, if we're never watching our own mind. So Buddhism is directing us back to that, to really, there's an opportunity that is often not, we don't take the opportunity very often to just come back to our own leaning, to understand our own leaning. But there is just a wealth of, that's where it's all at. Basically, everything else, whatever we consider the outside world, is always just another philosophy, basically. It's another way of trying to package things or make judgments and valuations. But what is immediately happening is, it's just what experience is. I think even at some point it can be understood that it's not even our experience as a particular person. That this whole scenery, this in concert quality of what reality is actually what is happening. It's not me trying to be mindful. We can just drop every idea that we have about resting in awareness and just rest in awareness. I'll open it up for questions here just in a second, but just to cap it off, there's plenty of opportunities, I think. Speaking of resting in awareness, it's the sunlight streaming in through the windows, or we're in the house and the sound of the rain. All of a sudden, the sound of the rain is there. We're back in this moment, so to speak. Coming back to the breath, a heated conversation, just collecting the mind a little bit during that turbulence, coming back. We're on a trail and there's a scourge of mosquitoes, and our world is exploding in anger and like, I gotta get out of here. But just enjoy that moment. No, that might be going a little too far. But really, there's so many different types of annoyances that really, I think if we could come back to this level field of this moment, really we don't need to burden ourselves with so many different annoyances and valuations that we get caught up in. Thich Nhat Hanh says, we don't need to wait for the chores to be done to be happy. And so seeing and smelling and touching this rose that's right there is just enough, really. To have a simple conversation with somebody is enough, moment by moment. And naturally, the signs can just fade off into the background. They don't need to hold nearly the importance that we normally attribute to them. That's all I have for today. If you have any questions at all, we can do that we got a few minutes here left over if you have anything. Mike has a question. Go ahead, Mike.
What were the 3 doors of liberation again?
Let's see here. Animita, Shunyata, and Apranahita.
Huh.
Okay, signlessness, emptiness, and non-pursuit. I would say non-gaining.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and these are, there's many teachings, Buddhist teachings out there, so they're all pointing to the same thing in the end. So there's a lot of lists in Buddhism, but really it's all, the Buddha said, I teach awareness, dukkha and the release from dukkha. Go ahead.
Jed, thanks so much for your talk. I really appreciated it. One thing it made me think of with regard to nature is that, I also find myself canoeing up north at times. And, one thing that it reframes your control on the situation in the sense that you have to pay, you have to be present to what is going on, but then you also, like you were talking about signs and signlessness, there's things that you have to do, the relative things that you have to do to take care of that situation. So, one thing that I find interesting is like, when you're up north, you can see, quote unquote, danger coming your way, whether it's a thunderstorm or whatever. And it's that presence, that signlessness of reality showing up, but also the relative things that you have to do, like maybe get off the lake or put your rain fly on your tent or something like that. And it just reminded me too of, things that Steve or Norm say on, hold those, in this case, signs lightly. Don't grip them. And watch your mind, like you were talking about, the people, the heated conversations and that kind of thing. Watch your mind. Take care of your mind. Don't worry so much about trying to, like you said, control the situation or others. So, not really a question. Just wanted to thank you and make that comment.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that. That's precisely what we always have to work with, is what appears as the relative world. It's there's nothing to transcend. It's understanding true signlessness happens here in the world of signs. Yeah. Definitely got to get out of the way of the big windstorm coming at you. I think that should be it. So great to see everybody. Thanks again. Nice to see you.